Good morning, everybody, panelists, attendees, as well as those viewing on various live streamed platforms. I'm going to give it another half a minute or so, and then we will kick off. In the meanwhile, welcome to this working paper launch, a working paper on carbon border adjustment mechanisms, or CBAMs, in this land of acronyms, and their implications for South Africa. The paper is being launched on the website as we speak, and Ntabiseng in the chat will post the link through which you can access such paper. Okay, good morning, everybody. I see we've got a really good turnout of attendees to this seminar webinar on carbon border adjustment mechanisms, as well as their implications for South Africa. One panelist has not yet joined us, and I would ask, please, the comms team to keep an eye out for Faizel Ismael and promote him to panelist if he does and when he does join. With that said, good morning. By way of introduction, I am Deepak Patel, and I head up the portfolio of climate finance and innovation in the Presidential Climate Commission. I see someone's got their hand up already. Mzwandile, is this a point of order? Let's promote him. Good morning, Mzwandile. I see your hand is up. Is this a point of order? Okay, he's muted, so I'm going to continue. Sorry about that. I'm Deepak Patel, Head of Climate Finance and Innovation in the Secretariat of the Presidential Climate Commission. As we undertake our decarbonization journey in terms of a just transition framework, which we have presented and which has been adopted by the Cabinet of South Africa as the framework within which our just transition will unfold, we are aware of many opportunities and risks as we undertake such a deep transition. Within that transition is of critical importance that we maintain competitiveness of our current industrial, energy, and mining complex. And it is in that context that we, in understanding that the European Green Deal has now led to a carbon border adjustment mechanism that is agreed by the EU, as well as other countries in their own climate response, undertaking domestically driven processes to ensure not only decarbonization and reduction of other greenhouse gas emissions, but also in some respects, as I think we will hear during the course of this webinar, a protective set of mechanisms to protect their own domestic socioeconomic environment. And it is in this context that we in the PCC feel that attention being paid to the question of CBAMs is of critical importance, given the deep industrial transformation that is going to be absolutely critical as we undertake our just transition. The structure of the webinar is going to be the presentation of the contours, and outline, and content of the working paper, which we as the PCC commissioned, and which was authored by John Ward, present here, who will take us through his analysis and findings, in particular of the European CBAM, but also hopefully draw conclusive statements or give us some sense of what the international environment looks like with respect to other countries' responses, and then what the implications of the CBAM and CBAMs around the world are likely to be for South African industry and our socioeconomic complex. Without any further ado, let me hand over to John Ward, who will then be followed by each of our panelists giving responses of a few minutes, and then through the chat, as well as possibly a raising of hands, we can try to have a conversation, setting the stage for a much deeper set of engagements with stakeholders in the South African landscape around the implications of CBAMs. Welcome, panelists, and John Ward, up to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deepak, and good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be with you all, at least virtually today. I'm very happy to be able to share some of the summary findings from this little landscape paper that we prepared for the PCC. So let me just share my screen so that I can use the slides. Hopefully that's working okay. Let me just blow it up. So very good. So as I say, thank you very much. And what I'd like to do today is really go through four main topics that are covered in the working paper, and use those as a platform for a broader conversation. So first of all, just wanted to start with a little bit of an understanding of why policymakers, especially in the EU, are thinking about the CBAM, and what were the motivations which have come behind that. Secondly, I then want to go into a little bit more detail about the design of the CBAM proposal in the EU. I think it's important to stress that there hasn't just been a single design which has been always on the table and which has been kind of developed over time, but there have actually been a range of different proposals that have been made by different policymakers, and understanding how those have been shaped and how those are now coming together to form a kind of single final perspective, I think is hopefully really interesting and important. Thirdly, I want to spend a little bit of time looking at some of the existing analysis regarding what the possible implications of this may be for South Africa. And then finally, a little bit of a discussion on potential next steps, in which I will also try and respond to Deepak's questions about responses and reactions by others. Okay, so just a little bit then in terms of the CBAM objectives. Well, first of all, just to say a little bit about what a CBAM is. And really, at the very highest level, it's about a policy instrument which is introduced with the intention of trying to increase the consistency with which carbon pricing is applied between goods which are produced in different jurisdictions, but then traded between them. And so at its base, at a kind of all CBAM proposals, including the EU one, have at their heart this idea that countries or jurisdictions that already have a carbon price through an ETS or a carbon tax might seek to apply a charge, an equivalent carbon price on those imports coming into that jurisdiction from other countries. And therefore, in our case, and in the context of the work that we're looking at, that would mean that those South African exports of certain carbon intensive goods would face an extra carbon cost liability. And that would, the fear being that that would obviously make them more expensive and therefore less competitive, and therefore demand for those products would fall over time. As we'll go on to talk about, CBAM can do more than that, or some options for a CBAM might do more than that, but at its heart, that is the kind of the simplest aspect of a CBAM. And why are European policymakers looking to introduce this? So I think, without doubt, the most important reason behind their this policy innovation is a belief that this will help them in their job in reducing the fear or the risk of carbon leakage within the European Union. So at the moment, they are looking to accelerate climate action and increase the price in the EU ETS. And there's a concern that doing that would lead to European producers being competitively disadvantaged, and a perception that the previous way in which this has been managed within the EU, by providing those installations, those companies with free allowances, is no longer fit for purpose and no longer appropriate, and that therefore they should be looking to develop other methods for preventing carbon leakage. And you look at all of the material produced by the Commission and other bodies, and it really is the carbon leakage motivation which is at the heart of what has been proposed. That said, others have also argued that as a kind of a secondary benefit, the introduction of a CBAM might lead to other countries deciding to increase their level of ambition. And effectively, the argument being, or the perspective is that if countries such as South Africa have the option between, if they know that their exports are going to be exposed to a carbon price, then perhaps they would think it would be better for that carbon price to be charged, levied, and collected within South Africa and go to the South African Treasury than it would be for that charge or tax to be levied by European policymakers and go to European for the benefit of European taxpayers. So there's an argument or a perspective that perhaps the CBAM might also promote climate action abroad. And then thirdly, perhaps slightly less important really in the big scheme of things, I think, but nonetheless an important kind of ancillary benefit from the perspective of some European policymakers is obviously this provides an additional source of tax revenues for European policymakers, which can then be used either to promote climate action or indeed for other objectives as well. So that lies behind why policymakers have spent a lot of time thinking about CBAM and developing a CBAM. And I can perhaps, if in the discussion is helpful, we can go into a discussion about why they feel CBAM is a preferable method to free allowance allocation. But let me, at the moment, instead go on to describe a little bit more about the process that European policymakers have gone through in developing a particular proposal and kind of how this has converged in a kind of close to final design that we now have. And so the important thing to stress is that there hasn't just been a single proposal, which has always been kind of there. Rather, there have been different parts of the European policymaking apparatus that have been developing different proposals. So the Commission was the first organisation, kind of the executive body, which came up with the main thrust of the CBAM proposal. But that has then been reviewed and analysed, and counter proposals effectively being developed first by the European Parliament and then by the European Council, which is the body which is kind of represents the heads of state of the different European countries. And then we have this slightly opaque process through which these different bodies come together in what's called a trilogue process of negotiation and decide on the core elements and how they want to kind of mash together the core elements of the ideas which were put forward in the different proposals. And some people have likened it a little bit to a sausage making factory, in that nobody really understands or knows or wants to know how that negotiation goes on, but at the end of the day, you end up with the sausage coming out. And indeed, we did have that coming out in large part right at the end of last year in a couple of press releases released just before Christmas in December, when we got the kind of the broad contours of what the CBAM proposal, the European CBAM proposal, will look like. Although there are some important details which still remain either undetermined or at least not presented as yet. And these processes have led to have allowed us to kind of think about how a CBAM design might vary across a wide range of different parameters. And I'll go through each of these in turn, but they relate to the date, which trade flows are covered, what sectors and products are covered, what emissions are covered, and finally kind of issues around the geographic scope. But before I go through these differences in the proposals and where the European policymakers seem to have ended up, let me just kind of at least kind of clarify what is common to all of the proposals. And that's kind of in the basic details of how the CBAM proposal is intended to work. And the idea is that European importers will be charged with a kind of a legal responsibility to calculate the emissions associated with the import that they have made. And then once they have calculated the emissions associated with the imports that they have made, they will be required to purchase and surrender an equivalent number of this new instrument called a CBAM certificate. So if your imports are associated with 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide, then you'll be required to purchase 100,000 CBAM certificates. And the price of those CBAM certificates are going to be set to match the prevailing price for allowances in the EU ETS. And what I've got here on the right-hand side is just to give you an understanding of what that might look like, or what it would have looked like had it applied last year. And we can see that with the prices which were prevailing last year and the exchange rates which were prevailing last year, we'd be looking at a CBAM charge, or a price for a CBAM certificate of about 1,200 to 1,500 rand per tonne, which actually, having looked at some of the most recent numbers, is perhaps even slightly higher at the moment than these numbers suggest, looking at the most recent numbers. It is important to stress that that charge would not come in immediately. There will be a transition phase where, well, the first part of the transition phase, there will be no charges levied at all. And instead, time will be spent making sure that the institutional architecture of the CBAM process works well, and things like the emission calculations can be done properly. And then even once that has been cemented and solidified, there will then be a period of adjustment whereby not all of the liability will be charged on importers, and we'll come on to look at what those different phasing processes look like. Now, it's also important to stress that there is intended to be a rebate provided, or a discount provided for countries which already have a carbon price. Looking at what that would imply to South Africa, that might mean that South African producers might receive basically around about a 10% discount if they use the headline rate of the carbon tax. Although one of the things which will definitely have to be worked out should the CBAM kind of move forward and move into implementation is we can expect to see a bit of a discussion about whether or not some of the allowances embedded within the carbon tax design should be taken into account, which would thereby reduce the rate of the domestic carbon price as seen by European policymakers and increase the size of the CBAM charge. And emissions will then be assessed on some combination of actual data or default data, or if in the worst case scenario, the average emission intensity of EU installations, the worst performing EU installation. And again, I think most people recognize that actually calculating these emissions is again going to be an area where there's going to be an awful lot of devil in the detail, and working out how this process works in practice is one of the key areas of which there's considerable uncertainty. So that's the basic design. And then just moving on to some of the issues around the different options which have been presented. One of the differences between the different proposals was this rate of phasing. So the extent to which, the speed at which importers would be required to surrender 100% of the allowances associated with their import, with the emissions embedded in their import. And we've got the different proposals which are here, but you can basically see that the slowest phase-in rate, therefore the kind of potentially the most advantageous to South African producers, was the one which was suggested by the European Council. That's the orange line there, and that kind of only reaches 100% out by 2035 in quite a slow phase-in rate. The fastest was presented by the Parliament, the green line, which got to 100% by 2032, and really quite steep between 2027 and 2030, and 2032, sorry. And although it doesn't, I can't find it in any of the formal communication from the Commission or the European policymakers to date, the literature and some of the discussion around the CBAM has indicated that the final suggestion will be a kind of a mix between the two, and that's in the dotted line here. So a relatively slow phase-in rate to 2028, and then accelerating quickly between 2028 and 2033, which has kind of looked a little bit like the Council proposal in the first instance, but then quickly transitions to looking something like the Parliament proposal by the end. What we also have in terms of design questions is what's the approach that is going to be taken to different trade flows? So at the very least, everybody recognizes, or all European policymakers at least recognize, that imports into the EU will be covered by the CBAM, and that as the CBAM is introduced, so the provision of free allowances that European producers have hitherto benefited from will be replaced at the same rate, or will be phased out at the same rate that the CBAM is phased in. But what a lot of European producers are worried about is that actually those free allowances which they've benefited from up until now have not only been related to production intended for domestic consumption, but also have been used to help manage the costs associated with a production that is then bound for export market. But as European policymakers argue, with the CBAM coming in, that will no longer, and the CBAM will come in, the free allowances will phase out, and now European producers are worried that actually that withdrawal of the free allowances in relation to their exports to third parties, to third countries, will be taken away, and they will become less competitive in these third countries, including in their exports to South Africa, but also in their exports to other countries where they may compete with South African producers. And so there has been basically a lot of discussion in the European debate, in the European between different European policymakers about what should be done on this, but no firm conclusions have been reached. And it's definitely one of the areas where kind of it feels that things have been pushed into the long grass. So the Commission said nothing. The Parliament had said, well, actually, maybe European producers should be allowed to keep their free allowances for their production, which is going into export market. But that doesn't seem to have been taken up in the final proposals that we have. And rather, there's just this slightly vague statement that further work will be required on measures to prevent carbon leakage on exports. So we don't really know what European policymakers intend to do here. But from a very kind of crude and kind of straightforward perspective, the less support that EU producers receive in relation to their export market, the greater the potential benefit to South African producers and exporters. Third dimension, where we have kind of differences across the different design options, relates to which products from which sectors are going to be covered. The Commission kind of was first out of the gate and made its suggestion that that should include the coverage should be cement, fertilizers, iron and steel, aluminium and electricity. The Parliament then said, okay, that's fine, but we also think you should include chemicals, including hydrogen and polymers. And then it seems as if the compromise solution has been kind of to meet halfway in the middle. So we have all of the 5 sectors which have been proposed by the Commission, plus the inclusion of hydrogen as being the product that will be subject to the CBAM in the first instance. And I think this is actually quite an interesting development, the inclusion of hydrogen within the CBAM. Obviously, South Africa has very significant ambitions in relation to its green hydrogen production and potential exports. And whereas generally speaking, there are lots of concerns that the CBAM will disadvantage South African producers and South African exports, actually this could be a little bit of a, more than a little bit, a significant stimulus to the green hydrogen production in South African if it's going for exports, because South Africa's green hydrogen export would be obviously attract a much lower charge, if any charge, from the CBAM compared to conventional grey hydrogen exports. So whereas overall there are obviously very significant concerns as to what might happen to South African producers from the CBAM, this particular inclusion of hydrogen maybe is something which is very interesting and may actually provide a little bit of a stimulus for for South African producers. While that may be a benefit to South African producers, the final issue in terms of, or one of the final issues in relation to CBAM design, where things have perhaps gone not in the direction that would suit South African policymakers, is in relation to which emissions are included in the CBAM charge. Now, all of the proposals recognise that direct emissions should be included in the within the calculation of the emissions for which CBAM certificates would have to be surrendered. And all of them also noted that embedded emissions should also be calculated where possible. So embedded emissions would be those emissions which are, so they imagine you're a steel fabricator, your direct emissions associated with the actual kind of shaping and molding and painting of the steel are very small, but you are obviously working with a product which is carbon intensive. So the idea would be that if you capture embedded emissions, then that steel fabricator would also attract a charge reflecting the carbon intensity of the steel that they have been shaping and fabricating. So that was where the Commission was, and it was also where the Council was. But what the Parliament then said is, we also think that indirect emissions should be covered by the CBAM proposal. So the emissions associated with electricity and heat that goes into the production of the products which are going to be covered, the iron and steel, the aluminium, etc. And they argued that this was important because if we look at what happens in the EU ETS, while EU ETS installations only have to surrender allowances for their direct emissions, they do see the price of their electricity go up because the electricity producers in the EU ETS are also having to surrender allowances, and they pass that cost on to the electricity price. So they argued, the Parliament argued, that it would only be fair and appropriate that indirect emissions were also included within the scope of the CBAM. And what seems to have happened, although the language is very odd and slightly vague, is that it seems that the Parliament's suggestion that indirect emissions should be included has been accepted in the final proposal, where it talks about the inclusion of direct plus indirect emissions, which would be included in a well-circumscribed manner. And I don't think anybody, well, I certainly don't quite know what that means exactly, but it certainly looks, therefore, as if the indirect emissions associated with production of these products would also be attracting the CBAM liability. And of course, that's potentially a really significant and concerning development from the perspective of South African exporters, given the high carbon intensity of its electricity generation, which would not be matched by the emissions intensity of most of its third-party competitors. So the emissions intensity of steel producers in South America or anywhere else, and so would represent a really quite potentially significantly damaging and disadvantageous design feature of the CBAM as things look at the moment. And then finally, just to say that when we started the work, there was a question as to whether or not there would be any scope or any opportunity or any likelihood that different countries might be excluded from the CBAM proposal. I think the answer to that is a fairly categorical no. That has been looked at and kind of debated and concluded relatively definitively by European policymakers, that the only countries which would be able to generate an exemption from the CBAM would be those countries which have an emissions trading system which is linked to the EU ETS, which is the relatively small countries listed in the slide here. At one stage, the European Parliament's proposal had suggested that actually the revenues from the CBAM proposal should then be used to support international climate finance in LDCs. But obviously, whilst that would be a benefit to some African countries, it wouldn't be of material benefit to South Africa. As far as this is just, it's so far off the table in terms of the design features of where European policymakers are, that actually in the final proposals that we have at the moment, there's no suggestion at all that there would be any scope for further geographic exemptions, or indeed any scope on discussion on how the revenues might be used, as far as I can see. So I think we can be fairly clear that the scope for exemptions for South Africa is very unlikely indeed. So this is just quickly to summarise. We've looked at four main issues: the phase-in rate, the treatment of export, the sectoral scope, and the emissions scope. What we've seen is that the phase-in rate, the policy seems to be coming out at a slightly slower phase-in rate than the Parliament has suggested, but then accelerating quickly. We see that there's no real decision as yet on what's going to happen to exports. We see that the sectoral scope is going to be very similar to the Commission's 5 sectors, but importantly with this addition of hydrogen. And then crucially on the emission scope, it does seem that we're going to be looking at a CBAM proposal which has direct and embedded emissions, but also indirect emissions included in a well-circumscribed manner. So very quickly, let me just share a few pieces of analysis regarding what the possible implications are for South Africa from the CBAM. And I would stress that this is kind of under the scope agreed with the PCC. This is not new research. This is really summarizing what is already out there, or at least some of what is already out there. And what we have here is an assessment from the EU itself in relation to its impact assessment, looking at what might happen to different exports from different countries and regions as a result of the introduction of the CBAM. Now, it's an unnecessarily complicated diagram in some ways, because it has lots of different options which are explored. But the important comparison is really between these 3 options on the left-hand side, which is effectively different permutations of the baseline, so different options in which the CBAM is not introduced, and then this option 4 here, which is the closest to the actual CBAM design that has been implemented or has been decided on. It's not identical, but it's the closest. And what we can see first of all here is that the overall level of export into the EU are expected to decline. So here we're up at kind of 65 to 70 billion, but with the CBAM introduced, exports into the EU of these products falls to below 60 billion. And then if we look specifically at Africa, it's a lot of different regions here. We don't have specific numbers for South Africa, I'm afraid, but we do have Africa grouped as a whole, and it's this dark blue color here. So before the CBAM is introduced, we're looking at exports of CBAM products of about 5.6 to 6 billion per year going into euros, that is, going into the EU. But with the introduction of a CBAM, this comes down to 3.9 billion euros a year. So a really quite significant decline in exports of these products into the EU from African producers, demonstrating that most analyses, this analysis and others, suggest that there could be quite a significant hit in important export markets. What I would also say is that this is analysis which was done now a number of years ago when EU ETS prices were quite a bit lower than they are now, and therefore quite a bit lower than the price which will be applied to CBAM allowances probably by the time the scheme is fully introduced by the mid-2030s. So this analysis was done on a carbon price of around 45 to 50 euros, whereas kind of now we're looking at closer to 75, 80, or even slightly higher again. If anything, this potentially underestimates the size of the impact on exports from various countries into the EU because of the proposals. What we also were able to find is one specific study which provides results specifically in relation to South Africa. And this is provided in the table here. And what you can see is that this was suggested that the exports from South Africa of various products covered by the CBAM would fall by between about 9–10% for chemicals, right the way up to 44–45% in relation to cement. When put all together and included in the mix alongside exports which are not subject to the CBAM, that was estimated to lead to a total reduction in exports from South Africa to the EU of about 4%, which then translated into a total impact on South African GDP of minus 0.2%, which is obviously relatively small when you think about it in that perspective, in the scale of the overall South African economy. But of course, these declines in specific sectors will have an outsized impact in certain geographies, in certain locations, and for certain producers, suggesting that kind of the socioeconomic implications of these might be significantly greater than is illustrated just by a simple number of less than 0.02%. There are some challenges around this analysis, or some things which mean that it at least isn't the final word. In particular, it's not necessarily clear precisely how it has incorporated all aspects of the EU design. I don't think it has looked at any potential benefits in relation to export. Importantly, it is only looking at direct emissions, whereas, as we've seen, the latest European proposal does imply that the CBAM will also cover indirect emissions as well. What we have done to complement that within the paper is just a slightly one further additional piece of our own analysis, which is to say, well, this is all very well and good, but really, it matters an awful lot how important these sectors are to the overall economy of South Africa. So a kind of an almost 50% decline in exports of cement from South Africa to the EU is obviously very significant for the cement sector, but it matters an awful lot how big the cement sector is to the overall South African economy, if we want to know kind of where the impacts are going to be most severe and where South African policymakers might need to focus their attentions most significantly. So what we've done here is an analysis to try and understand where the impacts are going to be most significantly felt. And what we have on the horizontal axis, the bottom axis there, is the scale of the imports of these various products from the EU, from South Africa into the EU. So the products which are where the greatest trade flows from South Africa into the EU are iron and steel, whereas cement and fertilizers, there are very few exports from South Africa into the EU, or imports from the EU into by EU producers of South African products. What we have, so we've got the export value on the horizontal axis, and then on the vertical axis we've got a proxy for how significant the CBAM might be in terms of production costs. Now, this is only a proxy, it's based on European data, and therefore things might look a little bit different or more different for South African producers, but it does give a sense of the relative importance of the CBAM in terms of affecting the cost of different sectors in the South African economy. And so when we put these two pieces of data together, we can begin to think about where the impacts are going to be most pronounced, because we care most probably about those sectors which are responsible for exporting a lot of product into from South Africa into the EU, and that are likely to see a large cost increase. And that inevitably draws our attention to the iron and steel sector there, which is the sector which has got the largest export flows, and also one of the sectors seeing the largest, the third largest cost increase according to this analysis. Whereas cement and fertilizers see significant cost increases, but actually the size of those export flows from South Africa to the EU are much smaller. One thing I should say, and an important caveat to this analysis, is that at the time that we did this, we focused on looking at the direct cost increases, because our assessment was that that was the most likely scope for the CBAM. What we have now learned is that, of course, it seems likely that indirect emissions will also be included in the CBAM, and that would require, that will change this picture somewhat in terms of moving the dots up and down a little bit. I think the most important shift that we would expect to see if we were to do that analysis would be that aluminium would go up significantly, and that would therefore mean that we would also be looking very, we'd also have a lot of concerns about what the impacts might be in relation to aluminium, as well as in relation to iron and steel. Penultimate, final slide, sorry, on impacts. And what I also wanted to just very quickly emphasize is and demonstrate is some of this data in relation to the potential unspoken plus that South African producers might see from the CBAM. So as I mentioned before, because the CBAM will be associated with the withdrawal of free allowances from the EU ETS, that means that those European producers are likely to become less competitive in their export markets, and therefore they will be able to export fewer products around the world, providing a relative cost advantage or a relative benefit to other producers. And we can see that in this chart here, where before the introduction of the CBAM, we have kind of European exports of CBAM products of around kind of 75 to 80 billion euros a year, and it's then falling with the introduction of the CBAM to something slightly smaller, to about around about 72, 73 billion. So a potential decline in the competitiveness of European exporters in third countries, some of which could provide a small benefit for South African producers competing with those European producers, either in South Africa or in other countries around the world. Great. Let me just then, with my final slide, offer a few quick reflections on kind of what next, or what are the options for South Africa. As I mentioned, when we started the work, one of the questions that we wanted to look at was whether or not there would be any kind of meaningful scope for South Africa pursuing kind of its own kind of individualized exemption from the CBAM proposal, taking into account the for instance, the coordination and working relationship between European policymakers and South Africa on the JEP. Our assessment, having looked at this, is that seems highly unlikely, and that kind of that South African policymakers are going to have to deal with the CBAM proposal as it is put forward, rather than to try and negotiate an exemption for them specifically for it. And I think dealing with the CBAM proposal means one of two things. It either means kind of effectively a relatively aggressive start of seeking to kind of undermine the entire CBAM construct through some sort of legal challenge using WTO routes, or it means negotiating with European policymakers to kind of soften some of the design features, or shape or mold some of the design features of the CBAM as it is developed, so that it kind of better matches the interest of South African producers. I think option one is definitely an option, and I think it's highly likely that there will be a legal challenge mounted by some countries to this proposal from the EU. And I think we can expect to see this becoming a significant issue in international trade negotiations and international trade disputes in the coming years. Historically, however, that's not been a route, as I understand it, that South Africa has leaned towards in the past, although there may be options to kind of partner up with some other countries which are more familiar and have been more accustomed and kind of more familiar with using legal challenges as a kind of a core part of their trade policy, notably countries like Brazil. Option two would then focus kind of more heavily on looking at how can the CBAM, the detailed design of the CBAM, actually be implemented in a way which better matches the needs of South African producers. And that would involve kind of getting into the nitty-gritty around things like measuring the emissions of products and how that is going to be done, and possibly how, and perhaps importantly, whether and how and in what way to take into account the impact of policies which may well be delivering significant abatement and demonstrate significant ambition by South African policymakers, but which aren't captured very well or can't really be measured very easily with a headline carbon price rate in the same way that a carbon tax or an emissions trading system can do. And I suspect that that is going to be an issue which is going to be increasingly important as the CBAM proposal kind of develops ahead of steam and moves towards implementation. Whether and how and in what way can we look to recognise the impact of non-price policies which still demonstrate significant abatement and ambition on behalf of policymakers in South Africa and indeed other countries. And I do think there will be, perhaps we can talk about this in the discussion, but there are kind of fora and platforms which are opening up around the idea of climate clubs, which might be one of the ways in which the coordination for undertaking these sorts of detailed technical assessments might be undertaken. And we can talk about that in the proposal in the discussion. And then finally, just to note that there is still, I think, a relative dearth of evidence in relation to what the impact of the CBAM proposal is likely to mean specifically for South Africa, in a way which really reflects the design as we now understand it to be, and which would allow South African policymakers to think about that critical question as to whether or not it would be worthwhile increasing its own policy ambition in order to mitigate the impact of the CBAM and what the trade-off between that might look like. So thank you very much for listening. I would be delighted to answer any questions that I can, and very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, John. And to place John in context, John is an expert analyst in matters related to industrial and economic policy as well as strategy. And John, thank you very much for having authored the paper, which we believe is going to take its rightful place as we in South Africa consider what our response to CBAM, in this case, the European CBAM, and then other emerging mechanisms which have border adjustment components to them. I see a number of questions in the chat, and the way in which I'm going to do this is invite the panelists first to give, please, if you may, 5-minute responses to what you've heard, as well as provide your own perspective, given what you know about this area. First off would be Dr. Faizel Ismael, an old friend, as well as trade ambassador for South Africa to the EU for a number of years. And he, I think, understands full well both the political economic implications of CBAM, as well as the complex political and geopolitical context in which South Africa needs to find its response to this set of threats, perhaps opportunities. Faizel, up to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to you, Deepak, for inviting me to this really wonderful gathering. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you at the President's Climate Commission. And I listened with deep interest. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to read the paper itself, but I gather I will now be able to read it with additional insight. It was a good presentation, so thank you so much to you, John, for the presentation. I think I did read some of the literature on this last year, because I was trying to understand the concept of the CBAM, and so I did write a little working paper on it. And so I want to first say that your research has definitely added some real value to the literature. So the number of insights here and technical work that's really contributed to the literature and our understanding, particularly on the impact of the CBAM on South Africa. That's, I think there's quite a lot of food for thought there, really. Although, as you did say, there's still moving parts. So we can't really determine the impact because we don't really know what the EU's CBAM, what it is, firstly. What is the animal, the EU CBAM? Because it isn't really clearly defined. For example, as you mentioned, the scope of the CBAM is not currently, well, there's no consensus on it. You know, is it a narrow carbon, border carbon tax that is targeted at imports from countries around the world. Does it include what you call embedded value? In other words, indirect emissions. So that's quite important, because if you have to consider the full value of all emissions, you'll have to take into account all, the full value chain of that product. So if, say, for example, steel exporters going into the EU have to take into account all the inputs going into the value chain, from iron ore, for example, and say the electricity, because there's a huge item, but also other components that are going into the production of that steel, then of course it's a different animal altogether that will be considered, and how you actually calculate that, is going to be highly complex and mind-boggling. So that's still uncertain. But the other uncertainty is the date. When does it actually start? 2025, 26, 27, 28, and that's not clear. And I do think that there are at the moment so many exclusions and conditionalities and flexibilities really for European companies, and opportunities really for European companies to lobby the EU to firstly to extend the period of adjustment for them, so that it only kicks in, after a longer period of time. That's still open and still very unclear. So having said all of that, I'd like to say that firstly, I think that this is, in my view, I think it's a measure which is unilateral. It's spurious, the objectives that the EU has, that it for the use of this instrument to support the climate change response is spurious, because actually what it is it provides protection and support for its own companies in their bid to remain competitive and to compete against other companies around the world. So it's really a competitiveness instrument rather than an environmental instrument. I think that it is unilateral. There's no doubt about it, that its legality under the WTO is very questionable, and in my view, it's WTO illegal. It also violates a number of principles of the WTO, including Article 1, which is the MFN principle. So it doesn't take into account special and differential treatment. So, or in the UNFCCC, the principle of common and differentiated treatment. So that's not built into it. There are a number of issues there that could, a number of current approaches that could be taken issue with. I mean, they say that the tax that is collected will be added to the coffers of the EU and not distributed to any effort on the part of the EU or multilateral institutions to support those countries that are deserving and require support and assistance to make the adjustments that they need to move to a low carbon economy. So the money will simply go into the EU coffers and will add to the arsenal of protective subsidies that they are providing to European companies. This instrument, also has to be seen in a wider context. So what has emerged in the last year is the growing competition between the EU and China. and between the EU and the US in this space, in the same space, which is really about the competitiveness that all the major players are engaged in to make the shift towards green technologies and to enable them to also meet their commitments to the mitigation requirements of the UNFCCC. And so this is part of that drive. We've seen huge subsidies that will be provided by the EU Green Deal, and certainly by the US through the IRA, the Infrastructure Act, and now the new CHIPS Act. You know, the calculations are about $1.3 trillion or so over the next 10 years that the Biden administration is putting in place to support its industry. So yes, there will be a lot of litigation in the WTO in different directions already between the EU and the US, but certainly between China and the US and the reverse. And I've no doubt that developing countries will band together and will also take on the US and the EU separately. So it is part of a kind of a new global trade war that is really centered around the shift towards the new technologies, green technologies that everybody is involved in. So that's the context of it. But thank you very much. I think this is a very useful contribution. I don't take the view that we should negotiate with the EU to make some adjustments. That bilaterally, yes, that discussion should proceed. But I think the principal attack should really be a multilateral one. We should be demanding that both the EU, the US, and China and others really engage at the multilateral level. There needs to be greater coherence between UNFCCC, the WTO, the G20 on finance, on how we can collectively avoid this sort of war games in the sort of climate space or the green space, but really begin to engage how we can cooperate to work together towards a lower carbon and more sustainable world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ismael, for that. I'm going to call on Professor Dave Luke next. Professor Luke is a professor at LSE, but he has recently completed a study on the CBAM impact on Africa as a continent. And Dave, if we can ask you to stick, if you can, to 5 minutes in your response, that would be great. There are questions on the chat, which if you feel compelled to take into consideration in your response, please feel free to do that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Deepak, and for inviting me, and greetings to everyone. And thanks also to John Ward for his presentation, and to Faizel, who's an old friend, for these very important remarks that he's just made. Yes, we've completed a study of the CBAM and its likely impact on Africa as a whole. And of course, within that, we did look at some country breakdowns, including South Africa. I think our study is probably the most comprehensive that there is currently. It was undertaken for the Africa Climate Foundation. It's going to be released next month. So this is the first time I'll be sharing the highlights of the study. I'd just like to echo the last point that Faizel made, and that is that this is not a fight for South Africa alone. It's a fight for all developing countries. And the multilateral approach is indeed the approach to take in this fight. I think that was a very important point that Faizel just made. Anyway, let me move quickly now to the study. What we did is we took a two-eye gaze, if I could put it this way, in terms of the economic analysis. We also have the legal analysis, which I'm not going to go into. There's in time for that. And I think Faizel has highlighted some of the main issues there. And in a two-eye gaze, economic analysis, we did a traditional computable general equilibrium modeling of the likely effects. Then we also backed that up with a new quantitative trade model, modeling of the effects. We did that for the reason that CGE, computable general equilibrium modeling, is better for aggregating for complex aggregate effects, for looking at complex aggregate effects involving many parameters such as changes to investment, calculation of changes to carbon emissions, the EU tariff revenues, and all these sort of more complex scenario configurations. New quantitative trade modeling is better at estimating country level effects and also flagging results that are consistent or differing from the CG modeling. So the two complement each other very well. And as I said, this is probably the most comprehensive work that there is currently, because we looked at various scenarios in the work that we did. Just two quick points. Firstly, to say that whilst of course product coverage and all that, and I'll come to this, John too highlighted this, is still a bit uncertain. Nonetheless, we should all note that the African countries are exposed to the EU because 26% of Africa's trade is with the EU. It's an asymmetrical relationship because Africa just accounts for just 2.2% of the EU's trade. Then the second point to note, which again has been touched on, is that the CBAM is not a stable, determined shock, but one that can vary over time, depending on several critical factors, as you've already heard. The price of carbon. What we know is that this, of course, is determined by the EU's own market for its ETS, its emission trading scheme. But between 2012 and 2018, this price was was less than 10 euros a ton. It reached 40 euros a ton in 2021 and has averaged 87 euros a ton over the last year. It's expected to trade at around 110 euros a ton in the next 12 months. So we took all of these different prices in the scenarios that we looked at. Product scope, as we know, this is also moving target. I won't go too much into this. It has been covered very well by John. There's also the issue of the indirect emissions, which we now know is going to be part of this scheme. And that, of course, indirect emissions are related to the carbon intensity of energy sources used in production. Also, another issue to take into account is the phasing out of the free allowances to European producers under the ETS. And then there's the issue of the use of the CBAM revenues. We estimate that this could be as high as 120 billion euros a year, so it can be quite significant. And this again, Faizel highlighted this point. This could be an area that needs to be looked at very closely in future discussions and even litigation around the CBAM. Now, in terms of modeling results, it's not surprising that the results across the different scenarios vary, depending on the price of carbon, the coverage of the products under the CBAM, whether the EU eliminates free allowances for European producers under the ETS, etc. But at current prices, what we estimate is that it could reduce Africa's exports to the EU by up to 5.7%. And it could take about 0.91%. So this is just under 1%, 1 percentage point. It could take about just under 1 percentage point of Africa's GDP. and that's equivalent to about $16 billion reduction in GDP at 2021 levels. Africa is likely to be more severely affected, as I've said, because we are exposed, than most other countries and regions, such as China or India. This is due to the fact that production in Africa tends to be more carbon intensive, so it will suffer a greater competitiveness shock. And then, as I've said, the relatively higher proportion of exports going to the EU. The CBAM would encourage a shift from Africa exporting to the EU to other markets, so a trade diversion effect here. Africa is likely to shift a large share of exports of aluminium, cement, iron, steel exports from the EU to China and India in particular, according to our results. Let me just end with 4 more points. The first is that the CBAM will have less of a distortionary effect if the EU follows through on its plan to phase out free allowances of the ETS credits. Again, John touched on this a bit. I could come back to it. I don't want to take up too much time to go into this now. Then another important point is that Africa's LDCs could risk being severely impacted. And I think, again, this is another reason why the bilateral route to deal with this is not the route to take, but to take a multilateral route, given the exposure of African LDCs. Then thirdly, and I think this is a very important point to note, the EU is a world rule setter. EU standards tend to prevail. And this is going to set an important precedent, and it allows for decisions to be amplified in the regime of other countries. And we're beginning to see this. You all know the example of the GDPR, which many businesses from Africa to the US follow, even though, even in their domestic operations, as a necessity to ensure access to the EU market. So an ancillary objective of the CBAM, in the words of the Commission itself, is, let me quote, is a climate tool to push third countries to adopt more stringent climate measures. So should the EU succeed in this objective, the precedent set by the CBAM would have further indirect effects on Africa's trade with a range of other partner countries. So we see that the US, Canada, Japan, UK, in different ways are all now pursuing or considering similar regimes like the CBAM. And in many instances, these are policies that are following or learning from the EU's CBAM. And in fact, in our study, we model the impact of all of these countries, US, Canada, Japan, UK, imposing equivalent CBAMs alongside the EU. And we found that the weight of these equivalent CBAM regimes would fall less proportionately heavily on African countries than other economies in the world, such as China and India, who would be substantially affected owing to the smaller share of each of these joint CBAM countries in Africa's exports. But all the same is something that we need to keep an eye on. And my last point is that the intentions of the CBAM is not just environmental. I think Faizel also made this point. And I think we need to keep this in mind because it's an important issue on the legal side as well. The policy has a competitive aspect aiming to ensure that European companies subject to the ETS carbon pricing are not undercut by foreign competitors that do not face the ETS. So let me leave it at that. As I said, the purpose today really is to flag that this study is coming out. It's comprehensive. And the Africa Climate Foundation is headquartered right there in South Africa. So I'm sure that the first place that it would be released would be in South Africa. So let me stop there. Thank you very much, Deepak.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Dave. I'm going to call on, in that order, Reitumetse and then Gaylor. But if I can please appeal to both of you to keep to about 5 minutes so that the questions in the Q&A can also be fielded to the panelists or to John. Reitumetse is the head of environment at the NBI, the National Business Institute, and she was formerly the director of mitigation response analysis and the DFFE. Reitumetse, of particular importance, obviously, are the sectors in your constituency, your membership, who will be impacted. And so as you respond to John Ward's paper and its content, I'd like you to also focus on what the implications and perhaps responses of the sectors that might be impacted will be. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Deepak, and a great pleasure to, I think, join this esteemed panel, sharing our thoughts on what's happening in the CBAM space. I think to start off with, it's important that from an NBI perspective, we believe that carbon pricing is an important tool for transitioning, I think, our economy, but we understand and accept that it's a tool that's used more globally as well. So I think the principle in terms of using carbon pricing, this is really key, and we've done work at a company level, as well as thinking more broadly at a national level, the implications of carbon pricing and the price at which carbon is actually set. I think it's also important to highlight that, having said that, the carbon pricing itself is not the only mechanism that we need to put in place, but we really do need to have a set of complementary measures to support the transition and understand where each of these measures fits and really the implications and the interface between those. And I think this really speaks to the need for a greater degree of policy coordination and cohesion to make sure that we get this right. And just linking to what you've highlighted, Deepak, at a sectoral level, we have found in the work that we've done on carbon pricing and looking at sectors is that, the impact is not evenly distributed, across the sectors. So I think the initial presentation did highlight the implications of the carbon pricing and the CBAM in particular on key South African exports in the heavy manufacturing phase. But it's important to highlight that this needs to be looked at in a lot more detail to understand what these implications are at a sector level, but also looking at specific products that are key. This will be an important part, I think, for positioning how South Africa is able to respond nimbly and effectively going forward. So just, really acknowledging that the interaction between the carbon price set and understanding of the mitigation technologies that we have and the processes that we can start to put in place is really critical to understanding at a sectoral level how this will all play out, and ultimately then obviously aggregate that to understanding what it means at an economy-wide level. The two sectors that have been highlighted that are most significant, so I think the steel sector, which is the highest emitter in the heavy manufacturing sector. So this is a crucial one for South Africa, as well as aluminium, which is the second highest emitter in the heavy manufacturing space. I mean, these are critical to the South African economy and the implications when it comes to a jobs perspective, number in the thousands. And so this is an important intervention that needs to be managed and considered in a deliberate way. I think it's also important to highlight that through the work that we've done working with business in the form of the climate pathways and the just transition pathways work that's been taken place over the past 2 or so years, working very, very tightly with the industry. We acknowledge that in addition to the exposure of these sectors in particular, there's also a lot of opportunity in being able to actively and nimbly pivot the South African economy to one which is more green. So in the heavy manufacturing space, we can create up to about 750,000 jobs if we're able to achieve this transition and really take advantage of some of the strategic opportunities that we have. And key to this is obviously the renewable power resources that we have in South Africa and how it feeds into the green hydrogen space, both of which are really key for, I think, looking at how we can decarbonize those key sectors which are most vulnerable and most at risk from the impacts of CBAM and similar initiatives in other countries. And I think it really speaks to how, as a country, we do need to be proactive, having understood where these opportunities are and some of the things that are coming towards us. how we manage and coordinate ourselves as a country to leverage the expertise and some of the systems we have already in place that just need to be ramped up or increased in terms of the scope and the impact. The CBAM conversation has been one that's been coming for a while now. So it has been a slow train coming. And I think as a country, we have not been as proactive as we could have been. I think the parallel that I draw was when it was proposed to include airline operators in the EU ETS, I think in 2010 or so. And as a country, we were caught napping. So we've known about the CBAM coming, even though we don't know its distinct form for a while now. And I think it's really key that as a country, we are more nimble, again, more agile, more proactive in being able to set ourselves up to respond to these. But also, considering the change that we do have to absorb as a country, acknowledge some of the commitments that we have made ourselves independently and really use that to be the driver for our actions as opposed to responding solely to what is happening in other jurisdictions of the world where we have very limited control or influence, or where it'll take decades to kind of go through the negotiations in some of the key kind of multilateral spaces that have been mentioned. I think for us as a country, the key combination that we need to look at is how we're using some of these policy measures, particularly around the carbon budget allocation, how we're thinking of carbon pricing and the complementary measures that we need to be able to optimize our economic competitiveness in light of some of these huge global changes that we've seen. And this really does call on a whole range of actors to be able to come together and coordinate across key spaces, key jurisdictions, how we align our actions and our positioning. I think at another level, there are clearly complexities that need to be ironed out within the EU space specifically. But on the whole, I think that for the South African economy, our ability to respond is really well placed. We do have a whole range of mechanisms or processes in place in the broader regulatory and policy space that allow us to respond with more speed and to be able to manage and control what we want to see in the space. I've mentioned a little bit of the work that we've been doing already on company level carbon pricing, but there's a broader national carbon tax that's already in place. And those mechanisms, I think, sitting both at a national level and company level, start to help us to be more responsive and insightful in how we position as a country. From an administrative perspective, it was mentioned in the paper that this will be something that's key because of all the reporting and certificates and all that sort of thing coming into play. And I think for us here, there's an opportunity to tighten a little bit what's already happening within the carbon tax regime within our country to get better alignment and to be able to leverage some of those systems to make it a smoother process. We also still need to continue the tightening between the processes between National Treasury and the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment and other key stakeholders. But I mentioned those in particular because of the carbon tax measures which they manage, as well as the greenhouse gas mandatory reporting structures and processes that DFFE manages. And there's a lot of tightening that needs to happen there. I think when it comes to practical numbers and really making sure that we are able to inform how some of these things are implemented in the EU, but also the ease with which we're able to respond, that architecture, that framework is already in place and has been used to some degree. Lastly, I think from an implementation and a perspective, we understand what the pathways are for those key sectors, what needs to happen, which technologies we need to start focusing on, when those need to be enabled, as well as the timeframes. And much of this, from our perspective, was also informed by the pathways work. It's really time to be able to ramp those up. They signal an opportunity to respond to the risk, but also that huge opportunity that we need as a country to strengthen the economy, to grow the economy, and to be more inclusive as we look at this. I do think that another key angle that we need to be looking at a more practical level is around the data, request data requirements, and I spoke a little bit to the DFFE processes, but this needs to be looked at in, I think, a lot more detail and really positioning ourselves to be able to respond efficiently without the burden that some of these processes mean. The previous speakers already spoke to kind of the policy and the diplomatic focused opportunities in the spaces for positioning the country. And so I won't go into that in a lot of detail, to say that I do think, particularly in the green steel, green hydrogen space, there's an opportunity for us to be making sure that we're able to access key resources and markets early, and that will reduce the impact of what could be from the CBAM implementation. And I think lastly, I've mentioned it in different forms throughout my inputs, but this increased need for collaboration, I think National Treasury, business, but other key departments to understand the sector level implications of CBAM and carbon pricing more broadly is really, really key. It informs our own national carbon pricing mechanisms through the carbon tax, but clearly has an important part in helping us to position and to respond at a global level as well.
Thank you very much, Reitumetse, for that all-encompassing perspective from sector through to some of the system-wide implications. Gaylor, I'm going to put you under enormous pressure by asking you to keep to 5 minutes, but I would like you from a trade and industry policy perspective to look at what the implications are for South Africa and in the context of the just transition that we've committed to. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Deepak, and yeah, good day, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. I think a lot has been already said, so I can skip a lot of things that I would have said. But certainly, I think there's a few points worth stressing. The first thing is that when it comes to the EU CBAM proposal, it is in many respects the tree that hides the forest. Okay, it has been said, of course, many other countries are looking at it as well. And it's likely that if that sticks, it will become the norm, and that, you know, would have significant impact on our exports. You know, of course, the EU is about 20% of our exports in value, but if we add other destinations to that, then it will be much larger. Secondly, when we look at the CBAM, we should not forget all the other measures that are included in the EU Green Deal. You know, certainly the farm to fork strategy, the circular economy action plan, but also things like regulations around motor vehicles and the shift to electric vehicles into the EU. Those are going to have widespread impact on countries which potentially are even larger than the impact that the CBAM is going to have on those economies, you know, particularly from an African perspective, when we're looking at agricultural exports, but certainly also from a South African and Moroccan perspective, the automotive industry, and many others. So one should really think about it in a very holistic way around the impact of the European Green Deal on economies, looking at CBAM certainly, but not forgetting all the other measures that are coming. When we look at CBAM specifically, it has been said, you know, it is an extremely deeply unjust measure from the perspective of the global South, you know, and one can only wonder why there hasn't been more of an outcry coming from the global South on the developments around the CBAM. You know, just looking at Africa, there's certainly a number of countries that are going to be deeply impacted. You know, if you look at aluminium, it's Mozambique, it's South Africa, it's Ghana. If you look at fertilizer, it's Algeria. If you look at chemicals, South Africa and Egypt. If you look at steel, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia. Cement, Tunisia, Morocco. You know, the list goes on. So I think the multilateral dimension that has been raised is certainly something that we are likely to see picking up. At the same time, one should not be naive about it. You know, whether or not this is going to succeed is unlikely or unclear. We also know that CBAM discussions are not new. You know, I remember talking about it already back in 2009. You know, at engagements between UNEP and WTO. And I remember hosting in South Africa with colleagues from the DTIC and IDC workshop on the potential of something like CBAM back in 2013. So we knew it's been coming for a while, okay? And we also need to acknowledge that, you know, our carbon intensity in South Africa is much larger, much higher than most other countries, you know, 2 to 10 times We are more carbon intensive than all other countries when it comes to our manufacturing exports. So we have a lot to do. And I think when it comes to responding, the best response is to fast track the decarbonization of our economy. Is to go faster on decarbonizing our electricity supply industry and our energy sector, and also supporting our industries to bring low carbon technologies, be it in steel or in cement or in chemicals and automotive as well. And I think that then opens up the door to widespread opportunities in maintaining our competitiveness, but also accessing the market going forward. And I think we can pursue some legal avenues, but certainly that should not distract us from the priority, which is to decarbonize our economy and then make sure that it is competitive going forward. So for me, that is really the priority. I think the South African government can also do a lot in supporting companies, particularly medium-sized companies, to adapt to the CBAM, acknowledging that it is coming, setting in place the reporting, mechanisms and so forth. But more importantly, again, supporting the decarbonization of the economy is really the priority. And lastly, looking at what we do with our carbon price, because of course, if our products are going to be taxed either way at the border of the countries that we export to, being the EU or others, well, it makes a lot more sense for them to be taxed domestically. And then we can at least recycle the revenues from that rather than actually finance the transition of our trading partners. So I think it's about helping our industries get ready for it, fast-tracking the decarbonization of our economy, and looking at what we can do to ramp up our carbon price in a way that makes sense for South Africa to prevent us from exporting the revenues effectively going forward. In the interest of time, I'll leave it at that and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you for that almost macroeconomic and multilateral response wrap-up, Gaylor. Colleagues, I'm going to beg you to stay with us for a few more minutes. I'm going to ask the final response to the responses, as well as perhaps some of the questions that have been raised in the Q&A. John, back to you for the next 5 minutes, and then I will close. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Deepak, and thank you very much to my colleagues on the panel for their really thoughtful and insightful responses, and also to so many of you who have shown interest in the topic with all the questions which have been coming in through the Q&A session. I just wanted to perhaps make a few specific points on kind of how I see the landscape moving forward, and in light of that, try to understand, try to respond to at least some of the questions which have come up as we through the question and answer session. So, I mean, I think the most important thing I'd like to stress is that this is very, very clearly on the agenda. I think it's not, we're getting to a stage now where we can no longer say that this is something that the EU is considering, or that it might be implementing, or that it is exploring. We're now looking at a stage where we have fairly firm proposals. And yes, there are some details which still need to be ironed out, and it's perhaps unfortunate in some ways that there's less detail on the final political decision that has been reached than would be ideal at the moment, but I'm sure that's going to change. And we do now have some fairly clear understanding of what at least EU policymakers intend in terms of the emissions which will be covered, in terms of the sectors which will be covered, in terms of the date at which this thing will start requiring people to make payments, etc., etc. So I think it is now a beast that has reared its head and that is going to have to be tackled, and can't just be kind of put off and assumed that kind of will be on the never never. I guess I'm going to feel a little bit like dodging some of the questions around the kind of the big picture questions around whether or not this is something which South Africa could or should look to challenge. that is I think there are very clear arguments as to why it will be disadvantageous to South Africa and to the global South. I think the analysis which I presented in the paper and that has been corroborated by other panelists, by Professor Luke in particular, demonstrates that this is clearly going to be something which hurts the global South and that is going to be disadvantageous to South Africa and to the African continent more generally, and that therefore there is an argument to be looking at how to respond from a multilateral diplomatic channel. One of the routes which I think is perhaps most attractive for that, or where I think the argument is perhaps strongest, is in thinking about where this money is actually now going to be used. And it seems the proposal which was put forward by the European Parliament, that the revenues which have clearly been derived from economic activity which has been generated in the global South and in South Africa particularly, should be used in some way, shape or form to support the decarbonisation of those sectors. And that looking to think how that money can be used effectively to support global decarbonisation efforts rather than just European decarbonisation efforts seems to me to be particularly a salient point. That said, I do think then there are some very important things that South African policymakers can and should be doing themselves, kind of irrespective of the way that the global debate is emerging and kind of the kind of the legal challenges which are going to be taken forward or not. Many of these have been covered by some of my other colleagues, but just to say that these are kind of potentially quite boring things in some ways, but actually incredibly important. So there is going to be if this comes to fruition, there is going to be a really important debate about how to calculate emissions and what emissions should be inside and outside of the scope of the proposal. And therefore, the stronger and the more robust is the South African architecture and bureaucracy for collating emissions and being able to demonstrate the emissions intensity of its various products, the better positioned it will be to participate in that debate in a way where it is an equal partner and can generate outcomes which are kind of respect and reflect its needs and interests. I think there is going to be an important debate, which other people have mentioned already as well, about the way in which kind of the CBAM looks to consider the interaction between price and non-price policies and how non-price policies should be reflected in any rebates which are provided by the CBAM. And some people have mentioned kind of ideas around that in the question and answer session. And I think that kind of quite technocratic issue is going to be really, really important. And is an area of analytical work which really needs to be taken forward. I then also think that there are going to be some really important questions around whether and how South Africa wants to change its policy mix. And these are not easy to answer, but a number of people have talked about whether or not the South African carbon price should be changed, whether some of the offsets which are available to it at the moment should be abandoned in order to reduce the liability in relation to the CBAM. Things like this really need to be addressed and thought about very carefully, as I don't think that this stimulus is not going away anytime soon. And then finally, just to stress that it really does emphasize the importance of the transition in South Africa and for the opportunities that will become available to South Africa from pursuing decarbonisation. We've talked very specifically about the opportunities which might come from kind of green hydrogen production, green ammonia production, and how they would actually be incentivized and encouraged by the CBAM proposal. And so looking to explore how those opportunities can be kind of taken advantage of and the policy measures put in place to support those, as South Africa is already doing, as the PCC is already supporting it in doing, I think become even more important as a result of this proposal. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, John. And a very, very special thank you to our panel, Each of you added perspective as well as gave real content to the debate, which in Reitumetse's words might be coming too late, but better late than never, and better be proactive around these issues while we engage, Faizel, to your point, the multilateral system, and while we engage through the UNFCCC to seek harmonization of our mutual response to what we believe to be a global existential threat, and to find ways of country competitiveness in the face of some of the threats that arise as a result of the global trade system also adopting now a competitive stance based on their own domestic and political circumstances. So with that, I want to assure all attendees as well as the panelists, this is the commencement from our point of view of a very important debate as part of the mix of South Africa's broad response in the just transition, and to ensure that we keep economic development, job creation, and economic competitiveness at the forefront as we undertake a deep, deep industrial and socioeconomic transformation. To the attendees, thank you for bearing with us. My apologies, we ran over a little, but please do visit the website and look at the document. We will keep space open in our program to ensure that this very important topic gathers momentum and that we engage with all stakeholders, both industrial as well as policymakers, and then through the climate multilateral system to ensure that the voice, Gaylor, in your words, of the Global South is not left behind as countries make their own independent decisions with respect to their responses. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon, if not at another PCC event, at the next gathering around CBAMs. Thank you very, very much, and goodbye.